Okay. I'm going to start talking so that we can get into it. I know that it might take another moment for Jeanette to be sitting with us, but that's okay. I'll just mention, I'm sharing the screen with the sheets that I sent you. That are called Dio Mikorod Mea Talmud, Inc., sources from the Talmud. This is not by any means a full listing of all the things that the Talmud has to say about ink. But as I was preparing the Beit Yosef, I thought it would be wise for everybody to be familiar with at least the mishnayot that mentioned Yom, because we learned something out from them. And I threw in, as it were, at the bottom, the sugya from Masechet Eruvin, which anybody who learned the Keset HaSofer is going to be familiar with at least part of it, because this is where we get the term Melechet Shamayim from that story. The other thing I put at the very end, if you looked, I have here Mitoch Sefer Otzar Lo Azeh Rashi. There's a book which I actually have in real hard copy back home in Israel, called Otzar Lo Azeh Rashi. There's another book also. I have two of them. So these are books that were put together to translate Rashi's Old French. This particular one, Otzar Lo Azeh Rashi, has become more widely used, and I think now on some of the printings of the Gemara, when they have Lo Azeh Rashi at the side, it looks to me like this is the book that they're taking from. Even though in the Mishnayot here, I brought the commentary of Rav Ovadia Mebar Tanura, he's drawing mostly from Rashi's translations. And we'll see, if not either today or next time, we'll see that Tosfot disagrees with at least one of Rashi's translations. And it gets a little bit complicated. But as I begin, I'll throw out a question to you. What are the things in the Torah that the Torah tells us have to be written? That we use this, there's a command of k'tiva, of writing. What does the Torah tell us has to be written? If you want to answer, just unmute yourself. And if you don't want to answer, it's okay.
The mezuzot, the Torah, and the tefillin.
Yes, so those are three. Those are three things that have to be written. All of them are, the Torah talks about in terms of k'tiva. What else?
Megillot Esther.
So Megillot Esther, of course, are not mentioned in the Torah itself, but they fall in the category of Sfarim, right? So we'll see that we learn out some of the dinim of Sefer Torah from Megillah and some of the dinim of Megillah from Sefer Torah. And some of those things we'll get into later, but Megillot also do need to be written like a Sefer Torah, or the way Rabbeinu puts it. Get has to be written. The get has to be written, right? The Katavla Sefer Kritut. And there's at least one more which we don't write anymore today. And that is going once, going twice. So,
it's not ketubot.
No, it is not ketubah. Ketubah does not have a din of writing. Ketubah falls under a different category of halakha, which is the halachot of shtarot, of legal documents. And even though there are certain things that are similar to, let's say, a get, but they're not, it's not the same. It doesn't have all the same strictures that we have around writing. and we do write ketubot today.
Yeah. What do we no longer do?
We no longer write the parshat. If it's sotah, procedure against toward the sotah was she would be brought into the Beit HaMikdash and she would be made to swear. The oath would be written out, and the oath is a formula that's written in the Torah itself. So the Kohen would write out the oath, and then he would erase it. Right? We'll see this. I brought in one of the footnotes. We'll take a look at that. But even though we don't write Parshat Sotah anymore, but the writing of the Parshat Sotah does come into play when we're discussing laws of Ketivah. The only other thing is this. I was trying to remember exactly where I saw this relationship. The tzitz that the Kohen Gadol wore, right? He wore like a golden strip that said Kodesh Lashem. The Kohen Gadol would wear that. It was one of his garments. And in the command for making it, it says that it's supposed to be engraved. But in Parshat Kudei, where it says they made it, it says that they wrote it. So there is a relationship between Chakikah and Ketivah, which we know from the laws of Chak Tochot, and it seems to me that's also related to the tzitz, but we don't all make a tzitz anymore. So, okay, so with that, you'll see what I brought here is I brought the Mishnah Masechet Shabbat because we talk about Ketivah on Shabbat because it's one of the Isurim, one of the things you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. Masechet Megillah, because as Itzik mentioned, Megillah has to be written. And Masechet Sotah, this is actually going to talk about the writing of the Megillat Sotah, and in Gittin, because we write Gittin. And Masechet Yadayim talks about books that are written, books meaning scrolls of Tanakh that are written, and what makes them mitamei yadayim, and we'll talk about that when we get there. Then here's the bottom is the sugya from Eruvin. So what I did here, these are not even the full mishnayot. If you follow up and you look at these, if you look at the references, you'll see mostly what I did is I just cut out the parts that are mostly relevant to us. So I'm going to start here. Just a second. Okay. Hakotev shtei otiyot be'elem echad chayav. If somebody writes two letters in one unconscious act, he is chayav. He is obligated for having violated the laws of Shabbat. So he would be, in general, chayav in Hilchot Shabbat means that if you did something that was, if you did one of the malachot that you're not allowed to do on Shabbat, if you did it unconsciously, then you're chayav chatat. In the time of the Beit HaMikdash, you would have to bring, once you became conscious of what you did, then you knew that you did something wrong, then you would have to bring a korban chatat. You'd have to bring a sin offering. And what does it mean to do something unconsciously? This breaks down into two possibilities. Either when you were writing, you didn't realize that you were writing, or that you realized that you were writing, but you didn't realize it was Shabbat, or you were writing and you didn't realize that writing on Shabbat was forbidden, right? If any of those things happen, it's actually three things, but any of those things are chayav. And here it says, be'elem echad, it's talking about somebody who's writing either because that didn't realize it was Shabbat, or he didn't realize it was forbidden to write on Shabbat. Katav b'dio, b'sam, b'sikra, b'komus, u'v'kankantum, u'v'chol davar shuhu roshem, al shnei katlei zaviyot, v'al shnei luchei pinkas, v'heim nehegin, ze im ze chayav. Right, so these are the ways that he can be chayav. If he wrote with dio, right, which we translate broadly as ink, but of course that's the topic of our discussion. What exactly is dio? These other words, we'll see how the Bartanura translates them, but these are other kinds of writing fluids, or anything that's roshem, anything that makes a mark, that would make, meaning anything that would make a mark on paper or on a writing surface. The last two lines I left in because I needed the word chayav at the end, but they're actually not related to our topic, but we'll explain them. If al shnei kotlei zaviyot, if he wrote on two walls that were at an angle. So let's say he wrote one, right? Remember at the beginning, we're talking about writing two letters. Two letters is the minimum that you have to write in order to be chayav dioraita, right? The Torah would make you obligated to bring a korban chatat. So it brings up the possibility that maybe you wrote one letter on one wall, one letter on a wall that was 90 degrees to it, but I still see them as if they are related, like it's as if they're written together, even though they're not on the same plane. Pinkas, or on two sheets, two tablets or two sheets of a pinkas in this context means some kind of a notebook. And it would also be that if you wrote a letter, let's say let's say you're writing from right to left and you come to the end of the first line, now you're next to the binding, you're immediately to the right of the binding, you write a letter immediately to the left of the binding, then all of those cases are cases where if you do that on Shabbat, you're chayav. So we're mainly just going to try to understand the first part of the Mishnah. So what are these different things that you could be writing with? So the Bartanura says, Bisam, if you wrote with, he doesn't explain what dio is, right? So we'll leave that. And he says, if you wrote Bisam, so he says, Sam is orfimo in La'az, right, in the foreign language. And that we see here, this is taken from Rashi, and Rashi says it means tseva. It's orfimant was a yellow color, or yellow writing fluid in this case, that was made from an arsenic sulfate. It was something that would be used. I didn't know how much. I couldn't find out how much that was actually used for writing, but it was one of the things that was used in painting. So it could have also been used for writing. Sikra, Bartanura explains, is min even shetzoveh adom. It's a type of a stone that is used for coloring red. And we'll see elsewhere, it seems to refer to a type of lead in a certain state of degrading. You can use it to make red. The komos, so it gives two interpretations of komos. It says komos is either min afar, it's a type of dirt, it's tziv'o shachor, and it's black in color. Perush acher, another interpretation is sraf ilan, it's resin or sap from a tree. Guma, the vase. Right? So guma, what we would know as gum or gum Arabic. This is also from Rashi, as we see. These Rashis I took from the Rashi, and there's a sugyan in Masechet Gitin. He explains these actually on all of these Mishnayot. I think I specifically took them from there. Kankantum, I'm sure it's a word that you're all familiar with since you studied Sofrut. So kankantum, he says, is zag. ba'aravi, it's zag in Arabic, v'laz vadrioli, right, or vitriol. So vitriol is either, for our purposes, either means copper sulfate or an iron sulfate. Ubechol davar shehu roshem, latuye mayim shesharu bahen afatzim. Right, so when it says in the Mishnah, if he writes with any of these fluids or anything that makes a mark. So of course, if you've learned, a little bit of Mishnah, Talmud before, the question is always going to be when it's now making a broad general statement. So what is it adding in that wasn't in all these particular examples? So it has to be adding at least one other thing that I don't know already. So the Bartenu explains that this comes to add water that gall, right? Like crushed gall nuts had been soaked in, right? So it's like gall nut juice, galis, right? He says the afatzim are galis, they're gall. Shuhuro shem, because it makes a mark. Shirishumon mitkayem. Its mark lasts. It makes a permanent mark. And this me'afatzim, this will come up later in discussion. Shnei kodlei zaviyot, we explained, achat b'mizrach v'achat b'tzafon. If you have two walls that meet, where one is east and one is north, right? So they're at, let's say, a right angle. Smuchot zula zu b'miktzoa. They're next to one another in the corner. Al shnei luchei pinkas. So what's that? Sefer HaChendani kotev bo cheshbonotav. The pinkas is the notebook that the storekeeper writes his accounts in. V'afal delav al luach echadhen, even though they're not on the same tablet, or even let's say the same sheet of paper. In the Hagin, the Mikra'im Zaim, if they are together and they're read together, Kigon shekotvin al shnei siftei haluchin, like for example, if you would write, as I explained, on the edges of the two sheets, asmuchin zelezeh, that are next to one another, you're chayav. So the rest of that goes into a discussion that's more particular to Hilchot Shabbat. It's important to bear in mind that k'tiva, so how we define k'tiva for Shabbat is relevant to how we define k'tiva for Hilchot Stam, but it's not identical. Because what we see here is that for Hilchot Shabbat, if you write with any of these things, you'll be chayav. But we know that you can't use all of these things, let's say, to write Sefer Torah, Tefillin, Mezuzah. So now let's skip to the Mishnah and Megillah. It's talking here. I brought in the middle of the Mishnah, and it's talking about writing a Megillah. Hayta ktuva besam ubesikra ubekomus ubekankantum al haniyar ve'al hadiftara lo yatsa. Ad shetei ktuva ashurit al hasefer uvidyo. Right. So if the Megillah was written with any of these things that we mentioned here, besides Dio, right? You see, it's the same list of things minus Dio, right? So if you wrote it with any of these things, the Sam, the Sikra, the Komos, the Kankansum, or if you wrote it on paper or on diftera. Diftera is partly processed parchment. But it was not fully processed. In any of those cases, you're not Yotzei, right? So if you wrote a Megillah either with something that wasn't Dio, even though we know from the Mishnah here, even though these things are Roshem, even though they make a permanent mark, if you wrote the Megillah on them, or if you wrote even not with them, maybe you even wrote with Dio, but you wrote the Megillah either on paper or on diftera, and you read that Megillah, you wouldn't have fulfilled the commandment of reading the Megillah. Ad shetei ktuva ashurit al hasefer uvidyo. Right. So the conclusion is yotze until you've written it the ashurit. Ashurit refers to our ktav, the ktav ashurit, the Hebrew script that we use today. Al hasefer, which we see here, the Bartun explains al hasefer means al haklaf. He says al haklaf. It could also be on gvil, but we will get into the discussion about gvil versus klaf versus tufsustus a little bit later in the Tur. Uvidyo, but it has to be written in dio. I'm not going to read the Bartanu here. It's mostly a repeat of what we learned. Let's go on to Sota. So this is talking about writing the Givat Sota for the Sota. So he says, Eno kotev lo ahaluach, v'lo ahaniyar, v'lo ahadiftera. Right, so that's in something else called a luach, which could be some other kind of tablet. That, in other words, all of these are surfaces that are not proper skin. That would be either klaf or gvil. If he wrote it on any of these things, I'm sorry, so he doesn't write it on any of these things. Ela al ha-Megillah. Here it uses the term Megillah. Shenamar, and what's the proof text? The Sefer. I'm sorry, hold on just 1 second. Okay, no problem. I really don't know. I'm sorry, I'm here temporarily. Okay, that's okay. Okay, that was weird. I've been here for 2 months. That's the first person who ever knocked on my door. It's just a temporary rental. Zoom share. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Shenamar b'sefer, right? So what's the verse? V'katav et ha'alot ha'ele kohen b'sefer u'macha el mei hamarim. Right. So when he writes out this parsha that the sota has to swear to, alot is a term for an oath, right? Like a negative oath, or it could also be like a curse. When he writes out, it's what she has to swear to. He writes it bas-sefer. So this term sefer, we casually translate that as meaning a book. It's also used elsewhere in the Torah. It's the same. It's also the term that's used for a get, right? The get is called a sefer kritut, and sefer, of course, is also referred to later on sefer Torah. So in this context, we see the Megillah understands it to be like a sefer in the like of a sefer Torah. Ve'eno kotev lo bekomus v'lo bekankantum v'lo b'chol davar shiroshem ela b'dio. Okay, so this is very revealing. He doesn't write with komus, which we saw before meant srafilan. It's this. It's like the gum, and not with kankantum, which was the vitriol, the copper sulfate, and not in anything that makes a permanent mark. Rather with dio. He can only write with dio. So what do you see? Dio is something that does not make a permanent mark. So what does that mean? And the proof text is from the same verse, because it says he has to write out these words, and then he has to erase them, el mei hamarim. He has to take the bitter waters, and the whole thing that he wrote out that she swears to, he now has to erase. And the erasure is done with water. So dio, we understand from this context, it means that the dio is by definition water soluble. it has to be water soluble, because it's key to the mitzvah of sota that you have to both write the parsha and then erase it with water. Just to fill out, this got pushed to the next page. Right? He's not allowed to write with anything that will make a permanent mark, that will get absorbed into the klaf, and then you would not be able to erase it. The komos, the kankantum of the roshi, because both the gum and the copper sulfate, they make a permanent mark. Right? But dio, by definition, does not make a permanent mark. So let's look at the mishnah and gitin. So this is obviously talking about writing a get. And get does not have, even though get is also something that needs to be written based on a din d'oraita, based on Torah law, it doesn't have all the same dinim as Sefer Torah, as we'll see. B'chol kotvim, because you can write it with anything. And now it brings again our list, but here everything's included. Dio, Sam, Sikra, Komos, Kantum, B'chol davar shuhu shel kayama. So here it uses a different word. It doesn't say anything that is roshem, because we know that dio is not roshem, but it is kayama. It's something that lasts. So what we understand is that dio, on the one hand, you can erase it if you apply water to it, but if you don't apply water to it, it will last. That's the implication. Ein kotvin lo b'mashkim v'lo b'mei perot v'lo b'chol davar she'eino mitkayem. And we don't write with liquids, and not with fruit juices, and not with anything that doesn't last. Eventually, I'm going to show you the sugya here on Masechet Gitin, and this will become more relevant in our discussion. Okay, so this is what we know so far about dio. Dio is something that you use you can use it to write a get, you can use it to write Megillah. You have to use dio specifically for writing the Megillat Sotah, right? And these other things, some secret komos kankantum, you can use them for get, but you can't use them for writing a Megillah. And also, if you write with any of those things on Shabbat, that's considered to be writing, and you're chayav. Now we're going to skip to Masechet Yadayim. Now, you may be familiar with the concept that Kitvei Kodesh are mitamin yadayim. But just to go over it quickly, the Gemara in the first chapter of Masechet Shabbat gives a little bit of background to this, that there was a Gzeirat Chachamim, right? The Chachamim issued an edict that any Kitvei Kodesh, any books of Tanakh, if one touches them, they render that person's hands to be tameh. And the reason for this, does anybody know this? Do you know the reason for this? If you don't, then it's okay. Everybody's muted. But okay, so if nobody's speaking up. The reason for this was, it used to be that the Kohanim they would receive truma, right? They would get food portions from people, right? People would give them parts of their, their crops and whatnot, their fruits and grains and so forth. And the truma, of course, can only be eaten by a kohen, and can only be eaten by a kohen who is tahor. And the truma itself also has to be tahor. If the truma becomes tameh, it has to be burnt. So it's a complete loss. And for the kohanim, of course, that's a major financial loss. That's the main part of their income. So it used to be that kohanim had this idea that they're going to store their truma in the aron, next to the Sifrei Torah, next to the other Sfarim, because they said, those are holy, and my Truma is holy, so I'll put them all together. But what happened? Mice and rats would come to eat their Truma, and then they would start gnawing on the parchments. So it was doing damage to the Sfarim. So Chachamim made a gzeira that any kitvei kodesh are mitamei yadayim, so that because they knew that Kohanim, who were very strict about Tumah and Tahara, that as soon as see if their hands become tamei and then they would touch their truma, they'd have to burn the truma. So it was a way of keeping the truma away from the kitvei kodesh. So that's how this mishnah ends up here in Masechet Yadayim. Masechet Yadayim deals with the laws of Taharat Yadayim, keeping your hands tahor and all of that. So it tells us something interesting. Targum shebe'ezra v'shebedaniel mitamei et yadayim. Targum here refers to not necessarily translation, but it's just it's a way of the Mishnah saying Aramaic. Right, because Stam Targum, like we have the Targum Onkelos, and the Stam Targum refers to an Aramaic translation. So the word Targum by itself here just means Aramaic. So you know that parts of Ezra and a large part of Sefer Daniel were written in Aramaic. So you might have thought that since it's written in Aramaic, maybe those are not Mitamei Yadayim. In other words, maybe they're not technically part of Kitvei Kodesh, right? Anytime Chachamim use this term, Mitamei Yadayim, in connection to Sfarim, that's what it means. It means Kitvei Kodesh, or another way of putting it, we would say nowadays, is canonized literature. Any of the books of the Bible that became part of, that were deemed to be Kadosh, and became part of Tanakh, are mitamei yadayim. So Targum shebe'ezra v'shebedaniel mitamei et yadayim. So even though those sections are written in Aramaic, they're still mitamei yadayim. In other words, that's part and parcel of the actual books. Targum shekatavo ivrit, v'ivrit shekatavo targum, uchtav ivri, eino mitamei et yadayim. Right, so any section of Tanakh, any words or phrases or sections of Tanakh that are written in Aramaic that you wrote into Hebrew, you translated them into Hebrew, or vice versa. If you have a copy of any part of Tanakh that you wrote in Aramaic as a translation from the Hebrew, uchtav ivri, or if you use the Hebrew script, right, which is the script that we don't use, right? That was the script that was in use prior to the exile to Babylonia. And a form of it is still used today by the Samaritans. Eino mitamei et yadayim. None of those things are mitamei yadayim. Li'olam eino mitamei, kitvei kodesh are never mitamei yadayim ad shichtavu ashurit al hador uvidyo. Right, so this is relevant for us, that our Sfarim, which include Sefer Torah and Megillah, and of course Mezuzah and Tefillin, they would not be mitamei. In other words, they would not be kadosh in this sense until you would write them ashurit, which is the ketav that we use, al haor. They have to be written on skin. It doesn't here specify if it's klaf or veal and all of that. As I said, it's a separate discussion. Uvidyo. It says it has to be written with dio. So that's that. Okay. Are there any questions about what we've done so far? Okay.
It's all pretty interesting, but I like that there's backstory to almost everything, so that's helping retain the information. Yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
Good. Yes, I'm glad. Yes, I'm trying to trying to add all of that in. Okay. I'll just. I think we will just look here at the Bartanura on this mishnah. So he talks about Targum Shektavo Ivrit. Right. So in other words, anything that's in Aramaic that was written in Tanakh that somebody wrote in Hebrew. So he gives the example Targum Shebedaniel ve'Ezra, right? The Aramaic that we find in Sefer Daniel and Sefer Ezra, Uchagon Kidnatin Rum Lahom Shebiyirmiyah. There's actually a pasuk which I brought down here. You can look at it later. This is a pasuk that's entirely in Aramaic that's in Sefer Yirmiyah. There's actually Aramaic in the Torah itself. Does anybody know where the Aramaic is in the Torah?
The Kadesh,
No.
the Yiddos. No.
No, that doesn't appear in the Torah. That's much, much later.
Okay.
There's two words here at the end of Parshat Vayetze when Yaakov is trying to run away from Lavan, and Lavan catches him up, and when they make a covenant between them, and they take a stone, and they make this covenant over the stone, and it says that Yaakov called the stone Gal Eid, which would mean a pile of stones that's a witness, and it says in the Torah that Lavan called it Yigar Sahaduta, which is simply the Aramaic for Gal Eid. It's the Aramaic translations of the words Gal Eid. See, Bartanu doesn't mention that, but that's the one place in the Torah itself where we have Aramaic. So we have other examples of Aramaic in Tanakh. In Ketavo Bilshon HaKodesh v'chein Divrei HaNavi HaNe'emarim Bilshon HaKodesh Ikdaman Targum Ein Mitamin Et Hayadayim. Okay, so anything that was written in Hebrew that you wrote in Targum, or was written in Targum and you wrote it in Hebrew, so it's not Mitamin Yadayim. Ktav Ivri. I'm going to take a second and do this because we'll be talking more about the Ktav itself much later on in this series of classes, but let's just take a look and see what the Bartanura says about Ktav Ivri. So he says, Ktav Ivri, Hebrew script, Ktav Sheba Me'ever HaNahar. He says it's called Ktav Ivri because it's the script that came from across the river, and the river here would be the river Euphrates. In other words, it's the script that came from over there. Kutim kotvim bo ad hayom. The Kutim still use it today. And by Kutim, he is almost certainly referring to the Shomronim, right, to the Samaritans. The Bartanura, who was originally from Italy, ended up living in Israel. And I'm sure that he was familiar with the Shomronim who were around back then as they are today. So he says it's the same script that they use until this day. Yisrael, hayum mishtamshim b'oto ktav b'divrei chol. It used to be that Israel, in other words, Jews, would use that script for non-holy things, right, for day-to-day things. And in the coins that have writing, right, that have been struck, that we have in our hands today, that were from the time of the kings of Israel, they were engraved with that same script. So the Bartanura, who lived in, I believe, 16th century, maybe late 16th century, early 17th century. No, I think earlier, 15th or 16th century. I'm putting him too late. But people were aware of coins that came from the First Temple period. And they saw that on those coins, they were using this script, this Hebrew script. The script that we use for our books today, in other words, our Sefer Torah, Ktav Ashuri hu nikra. It's called Ktav Ashuri. That's the same script that was in the tablets that Moses received. Nikra Ashuri. Why is it called Ashuri? Because it is the most beautiful of the scripts. Lashon ba'ashri ki ishruni banot. Right. This is what Leah says when she gives birth. That right ba'ashri. When she gives birth to Asher, she says, "In my happiness, because the other girls, the other women will make me happy or be happy for me," and she called her son's name Asher. So what the Bartanura here is doing, he's taking this from the Gemara, Masechet Sanhedrin, which again, sometime in probably the distant future we will look at, and you may be familiar with it. There is a machloket Tanaim about what script the Torah was given in. Was it given in Ketav Ashuri or is it given in Ketav Ivri? And there are indications in the Talmud Bavli that in the schools of the Bavli that they went with the idea that the Torah was given in Ketav Ashuri, but everybody knows that the term Ketav Ashuri sounds like it means that it came from Assyria. So but they say no, it's called Ketav Ashuri for a different reason, because it's the most beautiful of scripts. What we know about it historically, from a sort of modern historical perspective, is that in the time of Beit Rishon, the Ketav Ivri was the Ketav that was in use, and in Beit Sheni, the Ketav Ashuri was the Ketav that was in use. So it raises a lot of questions, and there's a discussion about it in the Gemara and also in the Yerushalmi, and we will leave that discussion for another day. I think because it's getting late, I don't think I'm going to do the whole part here of, well, we'll see. Let's get started. I think it's worth looking at this sugya here from the Masechet Eruvin, because we'll see how it fits into our discussion. So I don't do Daf Yomi, but this was recently in the Daf Yomi. Titania Amar Rebbe Meir. Rebbe Meir's, right, we learned in a Braita that Rebbe Meir said. By the way, I keep forgetting to point this out, but you may have noticed at the bottom of my sheets, I have this little key. Just a second. How do I get rid of this? No. Well, you can see it on your sheets, hopefully. At the bottom of each page, I have a little key. Oh, there we go. It says, that's a minute. All right, it says Mafteach. You may have caught on, I use different fonts depending on the origin of the text. So I use a Times New Roman for anything that's from the Mishnah or a Braita, which I explained last week. I use this David script if it's the Gemara. I use this Narkisim script for Perushim. And I use this Notos Serif Hebrew for Psukim from Tanakh. It's one way that I think it helps to distinguish. I hope it helps to distinguish. That's why I do it. Okay, so here's the Gemara, Titania. We learn in the Braita. Rabbi Meir said, Kshayiti etzel Rabbi Yishmael. When I was by Rabbi Yishmael, Hayiti matil kankantum letoch hadio. I used to put kankantum into the ink. In other words, as we'll see, and as you may know if you know the story, Rabbi Meir was a sofer. Before he became one of the premier rabbis of his generation, so of course he had to learn. But even before he became a prominent rabbi, he was a sofer. That's how he made his living. So he explains that when I was we'll see from this story, his main teachers were Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. So he says, when I was by Rabbi Yishmael, I used to put kankantum into my dio, below amali davar. He didn't say anything to me about it. In other words, I had Rabbi Yishmael's tacit approval for adding kankantum to my dio. So from that statement alone, we understand kankantum is one thing, dio is another thing, and stam dio does not normally include kankantum. this is something that Rabbi Meir did for reasons which he'll explain later on, but kankantum was a separate ingredient from the dio. Kishabati etzel Rabbi Akiva asra alai. But when I went by Rabbi Akiva, in other words, when I went to learn by Rabbi Akiva, he forbade me from putting kankantum into the dio. So now you see I switched fonts, because this is just a little comment in the Gemara. Gemara says, "Ini, is that so?" Right? We'll see is what so. In other words, is what Rabbi Meir is saying here, is that so? V'ha'amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Mishum Rabbi Meir, he had as a tradition from Rabbi Meir as follows: Kishayiti lomed etzel Rabbi Akiva. When I was learning by Rabbi Akiva, Hayiti meitil kankantum u'toch hadio v'lo amar li davar. According to the tradition that Shmuel had from Rabbi Meir said the opposite. That he said, when I was learning by Rabbi Akiva, he didn't say anything to me. Ukeshabati etzel Rabbi Yishmael, and when I came to learn by Rabbi Yishmael, Amar li, so he said to me, B'ni ma malachtecha, right? What do you do for a living? Amarti lo lavlarani. I told him, I'm a sofer. Amar li, he said to me, B'ni, habi zahir b'mlachtecha, shemlachtecha melechet shemayim. So my son, be careful in your work, because your work is the work of heaven. Shema ata mechaser otachat, o miyater otachat, right? Lest you leave out a letter or add in a letter, find that you destroy the entire world. Amarti lo, davar echad yeshli v'kankantum shema. I have this one thing. It's called kankantum. Shani metil l'toch hadio, that I put into the ink. Amarli v'chi metilim kankantum l'toch hadio. And do we in fact put kankantum into ink? Amra Torah, doesn't the Torah say, V'chatav u'macha, right? We saw from earlier in Parshat Sotah, Ktav she'achol v'machot, right? The Torah is talking about a script that can be erased. So the implication is, if you put kankantum into the dio, you have now made it unerasable. Okay, so there's a lot of problems with this sugya, and we're going to do at least the first part of the Gemara, since we've gone this far. We have to explain. Don't want to leave you hanging. So the Gemara raises this issue that Rabbi Meir first says that when he learned by Rabbi Yishmael, he put kankantum into his dio, and he didn't say anything to me. But what I learned by Rabbi Akiva, he said I'm not allowed to. But then I have a tradition that said that when Rabbi Meir learned by Rabbi Akiva didn't say anything to him. In other words, he did allow him to. So there's a contradiction in the traditions. And not only that, there's an implication that Rabbi Yishmael was the one who wanted to forbid him, right? Because when he tells Rabbi Yishmael, that he puts kankantum into his dio, he implies that you're not allowed to, because the Torah says when you write, you have to write with an ink that's erasable, and if you add kankantum into the dio, you make it unerasable. On top of that, there's just a reading problem. The reading problem is just in terms of the immediate context. What happens when, in the tradition where he goes to Rabbi Yishmael, and Rabbi Yishmael here asks him, B'ni ma malachtecha? So he says, I'm a sofer. He says, be careful with your work, because your work is the work of heaven. And, right, if you leave out a letter, add in a letter, you find that you destroy the entire world, the entire universe. So Rabbi Meir answers him and says, I have this kankantum, and I put it into my dio. So why does he say that? Rabbi Yishmael wasn't asking him what he put into his dio. He said, if you're a sofer, you have to be really careful to make sure that you don't add or subtract any letters. So what's the point of him saying that I have this kankantum? So this is where the Gemara picks up. The Gemara says, "My ka'amale, my ka'mahadale." What did Rabbi Yishmael say to Rabbi Meir, and what did Rabbi Meir reply to Rabbi Yishmael? So, hachi ka'amale. Actually, I said it the other way. The way it goes is this: "My ka'amale, my ka'mahadale." What did Rabbi Meir say to Rabbi Yishmael? What was he saying to Rabbi Yishmael when he said, "I put kankantum into the dio"? And what was the point of what Rabbi Yishmael said back to Rabbi Meir? So hachi ka'amale. This is what Rabbi Meir was saying. Lo mebayi b'chaserot u'b'yiterot dilot ta'ini debakiani. Right? He says, you don't have to worry about. Lo mebayi literally means I don't need or I don't want. In other words, I don't even need to worry about. Like, don't worry about chaserot v'yiterot. In other words, adding in, leaving out letters or adding in letters that you brought up. That's something you have to be very careful about. Dilo ta'ina, I don't make a mistake. Debakiani, I'm an expert in chaser v'yeter. I'm an expert in copying the text precisely. Ela afilu mechash lizvuvani. He says that more than that, Rabbi Yishmael. I'm worried that maybe a fly. I'm worried about even a fly. That what? Dilma ati v'ati v'tage dedalit umachikle umashavile reish. Because maybe I've written a dalid, and maybe a fly is going to set on the top right corner of my dalid, and it's going to take away the ink that's in that corner. And when the fly takes off, it won't be a dalid anymore. It'll be a reish. Right? So he says, not only am I expert in making sure that all the words are there in their wholeness with their chaser and their yeter, but I'm also even concerned about the smallest part of any letter, including the, let's say, like the tag of the dalet. So it sounds like the way he made his dalet, he would make probably, he would make the roof and he'd make the regel, and when he pulled down the regel, probably had a little bit sticking up on the top right, or else it means that it went over the regel that we made it, but he made a sharp corner with something extra, either going out to the right or going up on top. So it was something very slight, right? So that if a fly landed on it and he had written it with ink, then the fly could erase that point. It could erase that part of the letter and make it into a reish. So he says, I'm even concerned about that. Not only am I concerned about chaser b'yeter, I'm concerned about even the smallest parts of my letters. So therefore, davar echad yeshli v'kankantum shemo. And that's why I have this thing, kankantum. I put it into the ink, and metil etoch hadio. And therefore what? What does the kankantum do? It makes it permanent. So that even if a fly does rest on it, it can't erase it. So that's to make sense of his conversation with Rabbi Yishmael. The Gemara ends off by asking a different question, though. Kasha asra asra, right? There's still a problem, because in the first version of the Braita, it was Rabbi Akiva who was Oser Kankantum. In the second version, it sounds like it was Rabbi Yishmael who was Oser. In other words, at the end of this discussion with Rabbi Yishmael, it ends off with Rabbi Yishmael saying that you're not allowed to use Kankantum because you have to write with ink that could be erased. So it's a problem because Rabbi Yishmael, in the first case, allows it, and then later on it sounds like he's forbidding it, and vice versa with Rabbi Akiva. So that's a kasha. That's a right kasha in the Gemara. You may know it's a technical term. It means a contradiction. Kasha always means that there's a contradiction in sources. Bishlama shimush shimush lo kasha. So you could also ask this question here. Right. This is the first question I skipped. Kasha shimush shimush. There's a problem with whom shimush here means to serve in the sense of studying by, right? So it says, in the first instance, it says that he studied by Rabbi Yishmael, and then he went to study by Rabbi Akiva. In the second iteration, it says he studied by Rabbi Akiva, and then he went to study by Rabbi Yishmael, right? As Rashi explains, Kasha shimusha shimush de ka'amar le'el, kamei Rabbi Yishmael shimesh t'vila. First he studied in front of Rabbi Yishmael, v'hachatani ibcha. Here we learn it the other way around. Rabbi Akiva, here we learn it the other way around. He studied by Rabbi Akiva first. And Rashi adds in so that we'll understand the conclusion. Rabbi Akiva haya charif tuva. Rabbi Akiva was sharper. And Rabbi Akiva was more the keener. I don't want to say he was intelligent, but he was charif in the sense of being able to rip apart arguments and build up new arguments. So Rashi adds in, Rabbi Meir, in fact, first went to Rabbi Akiva, but he was so charif, he was so sharp that Rabbi Meir couldn't learn with him at the beginning. So that's how the Gemara ends up here. Rashi's anticipating what it says here. Ishlam shimush shimush lo kasha. So we can, it goes okay. We can understand how there isn't really a contradiction in the stories between who he served first. That's not a contradiction. Why? Because what happened was me'ikara atalaka me Rabbi Akiva. In the beginning, he came before Rabbi Akiva. Since he couldn't stand, I don't mean stand in the sense of that he was put off, but he wasn't able to persist in learning with Rabbi Akiva, like Rashi explained, because Rabbi Akiva was so charif, it was too much for him at the beginning of his studies. Atalaka made Rabbi Yishmael the gemara. So first he went from Rabbi Akiva to learn with Rabbi Yishmael, and he learned his gemara just means he learned his learning. Rashi explains what it means is mishnayot shekibel meirabotav. He learned his mishnayot, right, which is the basis of all this learning. And mishnayot here is an inclusive term. It's all of the mishnah that we know, and it also would include the braitot, because Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Meir are all way earlier than the Mishnah per se that we have that was redacted in the beginning of the 3rd century. They were all survivors of the destruction of Jerusalem, which happened in 70 CE, right? So it meant that so what happened? Rabbi Meir first learned by Rabbi Akiva. He found that it was too much for him. It was too much for him to handle at the beginning. So he went and he studied by Rabbi Yishmael, and Rabbi Yishmael taught him all of the basic literature that he would need to know, which back then was really the oral Torah. He learned all his Mishnayot from Rabbi Yishmael. And later on, he went to study with Rabbi Akiva, the Savar Sabra. And then he learned, he thought his thinking, in other words, Svara in this sense is like deeper understanding of the traditions, of the texts. Rashi explains that later on he went to learn with Rabbi Akiva, who was very sharp and could talk in detail and take apart and so forth these discussions about that which he learned. Lashiv Tshuvot Mishnayot Zu Al Zu L'Taretz, right? And to Lashiv Tshuvot here, right? To not just to answer questions, but to put, to juxtapose different Mishnayot with each other, with seeming contradictions, and then to explain them, to resolve them. So that explains how it is that in one case it says that he went to Rabbi Akiva and then to Rabbi Yishmael, because that was at the very beginning of his studies. He started with Rabbi Akiva. I'm sorry, I think I said it the wrong way around. In the first Breita, it says he went to Rabbi Shmuel and then to Rabbi Akiva. But the second Breita, or the second tradition, it's like a Breita, it says that he went to Rabbi Akiva and then to Rabbi Shmuel. So that was at the outset of his studies. First he went to Rabbi Akiva, then to Rabbi Shmuel, and then he went back to Rabbi Akiva. Ela asra kasha, but we still have the problem that in one place it says Rabbi Akiva was matir and Rabbi Akiva was oser, kasha, right? So we leave that. The Gemara doesn't have an answer for that. You can't reconcile those two traditions. Okay, so to summarize, what we see from this story is that according to Rabbi Yishmael and possibly according to Rabbi Akiva, you have to write Sfarim with Dio, and it sounds like you're not allowed to add kankantum to it. You're not allowed to add this copper sulfate or the iron sulfate to it, because it will make it permanent. And that we understand is that Dio, in principle, is something that is that can last on the page, but it can be erased with water. So this is my general introduction to the Dio. Next time, we're going to continue. Just a second. Next time we're going to continue back in the Beit Yosef. Here, uvidio, that, right, you have to write tefillin with dio. And we'll start to go through. Are there any questions now at the end that you would like me to clarify? No. Okay.
I'll probably go through this a couple times, but it's a good start. Yeah.
Okay. No, thank you. I you know, the whole my whole aim here is to try to give context to everything as much as I can. I want everybody to understand. So I know that you came to learn Sofrut, and people. I'll also just say something about myself personally. When I learned Sofrut, my original teacher, I had to learn Kaseta Sofer. I had to learn mishnah. Learn a book called the Seif L'chor Machanot. These are all achronim, right? These are all books that were written like in the past 150, 170 years. And about earlier sources, he said, I'm not going to teach you that, but you should learn it on your own. So, so I took it upon myself to delve deeper. And like I said, I went back, I learned the Gemara, I learned some of the Rishonim, the Beit Yosef, and then it's very. I found it very fulfilling to understand that these sort of cut and dried piskei dinim that we learned in their books, all of a sudden I understand how they trace all the way back to the Gemara or to the Midrash or to Rishonim, and you get to see it in a much wider context. So I'm trying to do my best to put that on. That's it then.
Super.